Politics dominated the Churchills' lives. The Duke of Marlborough, who was Lord Randolph Churchill's father, was sent to Ireland as Viceroy, that is, Queen Victoria's representative, from December 1876 until the spring of 1880. The Duke and Duchess lived in the Viceregal Lodge, Phoenix Park, Dublin. Lord Randolph, who was a Conservative Member of Parliament, Jenny and little Winston, aged 2 years, lived in a house in the grounds. Lord Randolph took up the unpaid position as his father's secretary, and Dublin Castle was the seat of British rule in Ireland and was used for political meetings and banquets. It was whilst they were in Ireland that Lord Randolph went through a metamorphosis in political thinking that would alter the Churchills' lives for generations to come. The spark that lit the flame that altered Lord Randolph Churchill's quiet personality lay in what the Churchills found in terms of poverty and squalor amongst the Irish people that shocked and horrified them. Disaster threatened when it poured with rain for months and the potato and corn crops were lost. Fear of famine like the one of 1845-9, when 1 million people perished and a further 1 million people emigrated, now swept the land. Heaped on top of that was the nationalist movement for an independent Ireland, agitating to break away from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the leader of which was Charles Stewart Parnell. Lord Randolph persuaded the government to set up a small commission on which sat he and the expert in Irish affairs, Lord Justice Gerald Fitzgibbon, the law advisor at Dublin Castle, and they entered into the condition, management and revenues of Ireland's schools. Together, Lord Randolph and his wife Jenny travelled the entire 32 counties of Ireland to assess the situation. The Duchess of Marlborough, assisted by Jenny, set up a famine relief fund with Lord Randolph as its secretary. Its purpose was to provide food, clothing, fuel for the fires, and small sums of money to keep able-bodied men temporarily in distress out of the workhouse. Grants were made available to schools that they might provide meals for the children. Queen Victoria, the Prince of Wales, and all the great families of the British mainland donated money, and the fund raised over £135,000 sterling, today's equivalent over 21 million US dollars. It was this reformist and humanitarian policy that would later influence greatly Winston Churchill when he became a Member of Parliament. In Dublin, Lord Randolph used to sneak into the political meetings of Charles Stewart Parnell, and there he discovered a very different kind of political oratory. These powerful Irish speakers could shout and bang their fists on the table and be heard in a packed hall of hundreds and at street meetings of thousands, and they knew how to rouse a crowd to their cause. Lord Randolph travelled back and forth to the House of Commons in London, and the leading issue of the day was the Irish question. The years he spent in Ireland turned him into an expert on Irish affairs, and he was recognised as such, and this was the start and the whole crucial centre of Lord Randolph Churchill's political career. In the midst of all this, Jenny gave birth to another son on February the 4th, 1880, named John Strange, known as Jack. Later that year, both families returned to live in England. Now we come to Winston and Jack as schoolboys. A comparison between the brothers shows that Winston was ever in trouble. He performed poorly as an academic and failed the entrance exam for Harrow Public School. The headmaster took him in due to the high political status of his father, whom he admired. In contrast, Jack, who was over 5 years younger, was by far the cleverer of the brothers. A visitor to the Churchills' home one day asked Jack if he was a good boy, to which he replied, "Yes, but brother is teaching me to be naughty." Jack was a model pupil who was constantly top of his class at prep school, and he passed the entrance exam for Harrow School a year early. There he was again constantly top of his class and had the makings of a brilliant academic career. Winston would later admit that in Jack's entire school history, he had never once been given lines or physical punishment of any kind, so exemplary was his conduct. Jack wrote home frequently to both parents, and whilst his letters to his mother usually asked for a little money and a food hamper, those between father and son, like those from Winston, were more to do with which horse won which race and how much were the family's earnings from the winnings. Being the sons of the coming man in politics meant that both boys were looked up to at school, and they made extra pocket money by cutting out their father's signatures from his letters to them and selling them to their classmates. Winston and Jack grew up in a family that was obsessed with politics. Randolph and Jenny frequently entertained members of Parliament to lunch at their home, and 12-year-old Winston would sit amongst them at the table where he learnt political debate. Another force, however, had prior claim over the Churchill brothers from their earliest years: the huge wall-to-wall tapestries at Blenheim Palace, espousing the fame of their illustrious ancestor, John Churchill, and his triumph at the Battle of Blenheim. Initially, both boys, therefore, wanted to become full-time soldiers and had collections of model soldiers that were added to each Christmas by parents and relatives. Winston possessed an entire modern army, but he allowed Jack only coloured troops and no artillery. Their father, having made both boys superb horsemen, entered Jack's name into an army class at school. He arranged for him to meet Lord Roberts, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, in the headmaster's house at Harrow School. Lord Randolph was fiercely popular with the people, and he fought the old guard in the Tory party, eventually becoming Secretary of State for India in a Conservative government, and later Leader of the House of Commons and Chancellor of the Exchequer. In other words, he was on the route to number 10 Downing Street as the future Prime Minister. When Lord Randolph resigned as Chancellor, a messenger was sent to their house who asked to buy his robes for his replacement. Jenny refused, telling him, "I am preserving them for my son," meaning Winston. Lord Randolph approached the Duke of Cambridge, formerly Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, to secure a commission for Winston in the elite 60th Rifles, of which the Duke was Colonel-in-Chief. But in 1894, Lord Randolph was struck down with a fatal illness and died on January the 24th, 1895. Winston was then approaching his 21st birthday and was an officer cadet at Sandhurst Royal Military School. He took leave of absence in the autumn and went to the Americas to observe the Spanish Army in its campaign against rebels in the Cuban War of Independence. Jenny was a friend of Democratic Congressman Burke Cochran, and he welcomed Winston to his home on Fifth Avenue. Cochran would become a kind of father figure in Winston's life, advising him on books to read from his large library, and taking him to West Point, where he was greeted like a general. Winston was impressed by Cochran's style of oratory and was much in awe of him as a model of the man he wished to be. Winston and his companion, Reggie Barnes, then set out to Cuba as observers, Winston in the role of journalist for the London Daily Graphic. On his 21st birthday, he was in the thick of the fighting, following General Valdez, leader of the Spanish army, who was at Sancta Spiritus. 3 days later, whilst they were all bathing in a river, a volley of shots rang out that went whistling over Winston and Barnes' heads, and it was, according to Winston, a near thing. After his return to England, Jenny, encouraged by Bart Cochrane, hatched a plan with Winston that he should serve in the army for a spell to make a name for himself and then go into politics. Winston passed out well from Sandhurst and joined the 4th Hussars and went with them to India, but he found it all to be a complete bore and a waste of time and returned home. Jack had been their father's favourite, but once Lord Randolph was dead, there was no one to fight Jack's corner. In his final days at Harrow School, aged 17 in 1897, the headmaster, Dr. Weldon, was making plans for him to enter Oxford University to study for a degree. Now we come to the big obstacle of money in the Churchills' lives. In his will, Lord Randolph had left sufficient to provide for his wife and sons. When Jenny was a child living in New York in the late 1850s, her father, Leonard Jerome, was reputed to be worth $10 million, about $500 million in today's value. She had therefore been raised in fabulous wealth and luxury, and in adulthood she didn't understand the value of money. Jenny squandered the money on herself and provided large handouts to Winston, who was often getting into debt. She insisted she could afford to put only one son through an army career, meaning Winston. She sent Jack to France to complete his education, and he became fluent in French. Jenny knew Ernst Cassel, who was a stockbroker that handled the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII's investments. She took Jack to stay at the Prince's country home, Sandringham, where she introduced him to Cassel. As Jenny's father, Leonard Jerome, had been a speculator on the American stock market, she got into her head that Jack should become a stockbroker and make millions for the family as her father had done. Winston put up fierce opposition and supported Jack in his preference of going to Oxford, but his mother overruled him, saying in a letter, "I know best," and she didn't want either of her sons risking your necks in the army. In January 1898, Jenny had made it known to her sons that she had to find, wait for it, £17,000 sterling to buy up all the loans she had taken out. She wanted Winston to guarantee £700 per month to pay the interest on her loans, and Jack was cajoled into agreeing to pay half of this sum. Just prior to taking up his appointment with Cassel, towards the end of January 1898, Jenny allowed Jack to satisfy his interest in the army by joining the Oxfordshire Hussars, a part-time yeomanry regiment. After a month's training, he could balance the two pursuits, working in the city for Cassel during the week and joining his regiment at weekends. He was promoted up through the officer ranks, this is how good he was, to second lieutenant to captain, and then to major. The city of London, ladies and gentlemen, in those days was not considered a fit place for a gentleman, let alone the grandson of the Duke of Marlborough. There existed in that society an aristocratic disdain of those engaging in trade. Jack applied to join the Jockey Club, and because he was no longer considered a gentleman, he was turned down. He was, in effect, for years, only Cassel's clerk and secretary, having had to learn shorthand and typing. He worked long hours in the claustrophobic heat of a city office, organising Cassel's business meetings and taking down the minutes. Cassel was heavily involved in the Aswan Dam project, and when he went out to Egypt in January 1899, Jack accompanied him. He wrote a series of letters to his mother of his misery. Passing through Vienna on a train in the dead of winter, he said, "We have just been through field after field of deep snow, and it's freezing here." In contrast, they arrived in the sweltering heat of Cairo for the laying of the foundation stone for the barrage ceremony of the Aswan Dam. Writing again to his mother, he told her he saw articles about her in the fashionable magazines of the day, saying how she was enjoying herself at balls. In contrast, there is nobody here of interest. Castle gave a large dinner party for 30 people, and Jack had to arrange it. Later at Castle's Dara Company, Jack wrote, "I have been all day in a factory with a temperature of over 100 degrees. Winston went out as a war correspondent to cover in the Boer War in South Africa, 1899 to 1902, and was soon captured. His sensational escape and subsequent life on the run, wanted, dead or alive, made his reputation. He then joined the South African Light Horse, where he met up with Jack, who was commissioned as a lieutenant and troop commander, February the 1st, 1900. Jack was wounded in the ankle in his first action on February the 11th and was the first officer casualty to be treated on the hospital ship Maine. There, he was greeted by his mother, who had been the driving force behind raising the money for the fitting out of the ship and had travelled on it as an administrator. Jack returned from his injury to active duty with his regiment and served in Natal under Sir Edward's Buller, where he saw months of grueling anti-guerrilla operations, punctuated by some sharp battles in which he conducted himself with notable gallantry. Having served during the war, while publishing articles in the newspapers, Winston now returned to England, a war hero ripe for politics. He stood for the Conservative seat of Oldham in Lancashire, and he could now take up where his father had left off just 5 years earlier. For many years, Jenny had learned politics alongside Lord Randolph, and when he stood at election time, she had campaigned for him in public, which was quite unknown for a woman in those days. She now joined Winston and advised him how to make speeches and capture Oldham. Jack left South Africa in late October 1900 when the war was thought to be near its end, returning home with the ringing endorsement of his colonel, Julian Byng. He complained to his mother, "I have to return to that horrid city." Winston was elected to Parliament October the 1st, 1901, and was now set on a long political career. Jenny was for the rest of her life the driving force behind Winston. He took up his father's old powers of oratory on the public platform and in Parliament, even copying the way his father had worn his hat. Perfecting his use of the English language, he fought everyone who stood in his way. It was, ladies and gentlemen, this combination of powerful oratory and reformist politics that he had learnt from his father that was the glue that held Winston Churchill's politics together and set him apart from other politicians. When in 1904 he famously crossed the floor of the House of Commons to join the Liberal Party, he would pursue reforms that alleviated the working classes. He introduced factory tea breaks, and he was involved in planning the embryonic welfare state. When he was wartime Prime Minister, he said in a radio broadcast March the 21st, 1943, "There is no finer investment for any community than putting milk into babies." In 1906, Jack became a partner in Nelk Phillips, so he'd finally made it. For much of the rest of his life, he would sort out the Churchills' finances, investing their money wisely for them, and he and Winston tried to stop their mother squandering money at the gambling tables in Paris. When the First World War broke out, 1914 to 18, Jack immediately joined his regiment, the Oxfordshire Hussars, and went first to Flanders on the Western Front, serving with distinction at a crucial stage in the First Battle of Ypres. Thereafter, his command of the French language saw him appointed to British General Headquarters in France. He was able to keep Winston fully informed of the Army's progress in their constant stream of letters. As Jack was one of the few staff officers with immediate practical experience of combat, General Sir Ian Hamilton asked for him to serve on his staff when leaving for the Gallipoli expedition in March 1915. He served throughout the campaign as the Camp Commandant General Headquarters, a vital posting that ensured the headquarters functioned at peak efficiency for the duration of the campaign. Hamilton was recalled in October, but Jack remained in post until January 1916, when the last troops were evacuated to Egypt. He then returned to the Western Front and joined the staff of the 1st Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, and served with them throughout the fighting from 1916 till 18. In 1917, he was able to give Winston a guided tour over some of the recent battlefields. He ended the war as military secretary of the 5th Army and came home with a Distinguished Service Order in recognition of his particular service in liaising with the French Army. He returned to the city as a stockbroker, and 1921 was made a partner in Vickers da Costa. He was especially useful to Winston during the great upheavals of the late 1920s and early 1930s. In 1929, he accompanied Winston on a 3-month tour of North America. The Great Crash occurred while they were there, and Jack was busy thereafter, supervising the retrenchments necessary in Winston's normally extravagant lifestyle. He managed the family's tax affairs and was able to direct their investments into some very far-sighted and successful areas, including copper and gold mining, Marks and Spencer, and Gaumont British Films. Throughout the Second World War, he was helping Winston in the underground bunker that is today the Cabinet War Rooms in London, whilst continuing to hold down his full-time job in the city. He organised a staff canteen at Downing Street that greatly improved the productivity of Winston's immediate staff. Amongst Jack's papers, I found pre-prepared letterheads that bore Winston's stamped signature, and Peregrine explained that his father had acted as a kind of extra secretary to Winston during the war. In the years ahead, Jack would sink into obscurity, to the extent that few people even knew he existed. A whisper circulated, and several modern authors have claimed he was not Churchill at all, and had been fathered by any one of about 6 men. As he was born in Dublin, the majority of these men never set foot in Ireland. When I was called in by Jack's younger son, Peregrine, to write a new family history, I was able to tell from old photographs that Peregrine was the image of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. He bore a resemblance to Winston, and his elder brother Johnny even more so. It was apparent to me he was Churchill through and through. Winston would emerge as the nation's hero, credited with winning the Second World War. Jack did not survive to share in the glory of his brother's triumph. He had developed a tumour at his heart, and he died on February the 22nd, 1947. Thank you.